Thank you, David. I assume you want me to start now. So I, first of all, really appreciate being here tonight. It's a great way to spend a Tuesday evening. And I don't think I looked through the participants. I don't think I know anyone here. And so that kind of makes it special too, that maybe I'll make some new friends tonight. And that's one of the things I love about AA. So is that anywhere I go in the world, I know that there are friends waiting for me at an AA meeting. And I've traveled a lot, and so I absolutely have experienced that. So let me go back a little ways. I celebrated 40 years of sobriety this year. I got sober when I was 22, and um, my came into the program knowing absolutely nothing about Alcoholics Anonymous. Um, I drank and smoked pot for about 10 years prior to getting sober. So I started using and drinking at a pretty young age. And I was like one of those women in the big book where it says that we progress quickly and are gone beyond recall in a few years. And that's what it was like for me. So I was in my last semester of college, um, and I was considering dropping out of school. I was so close, but I was terrified and I lived in fear all the time. I'd been married and divorced already when I was 19 years old. And I just found out I hadn't talked to him in many years. His name was Alan. And I just found out that he died, I think in 2001. He was 36 years old and he died of this disease. Um, just found that out, and I felt really sad. We weren't married for very long. He was a high school sweetheart. We mostly drank and used drugs together. He was a musician, and I used to follow him around to the bars while he played Black Sabbath on his electric guitar. And we go to these little dive bars, and I would go and support him and drink and dance and get crazy, and then we'd go home and fight. And that was pretty much our relationship. That's why we were only married for 6 months. So, but it was still very kind of sad, to see your high school sweetheart die so young. And but this does terrible things to people. Um, After we split up, Alan and I really went downhill after that, and I got a job working at a women's crisis center as the night manager, and it included a room, which was good because I really was incapable of supporting myself. And the first night that I worked there, they had a library, and I was on shift until like 10 or 11 at night, and then I just had to be on the premises in case something happened. And in that bookcase, there was an AA big book. And I pulled the book out, and I was thinking about my father because my father was a terrible alcoholic. And he's also passed away now. He died when he was 65 of this disease. Um, but at that point in time, I was pretty young, and I still thought my parents were my problem. So I decided I'd read that book to try to understand my dad better. And I opened the big book, I started reading, and as you know, it speaks to you directly. And the way that it's written, I believe divinely inspired, it's it speaks to the heart of an alcoholic. And that's what happened to me when I read it. And I read for a long time that night, maybe read half the book and then finished it the following night. And I remember towards the end of the first 164 pages, I remember thinking, I wish I was an alcoholic so I could do this program. And I already was a full-blown alcoholic, but I didn't know that. I called my supervisor the next day after I read it and said, I think I'm an alcoholic. And she said, Oh, I don't think so. She said, You don't seem like an alcoholic. I think you're just making too big a deal out of it. And I was like, I think she's probably right. So I continued on my path and I would smoke pot before I would go to sleep at night because that's the only way I could go to sleep. And I often would call another woman who worked the weekend shift and ask her to cover for me at work. And we were allowed to do that, so I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I did it frequently because I needed a drink. What I would say to her is, I just need to go out and relax. I'm really stressed out and I just need to relax. And so she would come and she needed the extra money. And so she would cover my shift for me off and on. And I worked there for probably another year. And I got sober about halfway through that year. Um, I had been seeing a counselor for a couple of years, and she knew she couldn't help me. She tried, she listened, but she knew that I needed something more than what she had to offer. And she suggested I go get an alcohol drug evaluation. So I did that. And the woman who did it, her name was Judith, she ended up being my first sponsor. She was in the program, and I didn't know that at the time. And then I thought my boyfriend was my problem. So that's when I went to talk to her, I was like, I don't really think I have a problem. But my boyfriend smokes pot and he's really got a problem and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, answer these questions. So I did. I went through the questions. And then at the end of it, she said, I think you should go to an AA meeting. And I was like, really? You really think that? Should I have a problem? And she's like, well, just go try it, check it out, try it out. So I did. And I was pretty young, but I was very miserable. And I'm one of those people that I believe I was born an alcoholic. I had all of the ism part of alcoholism at a very young age. The selfishness, the self-centeredness, the fear, the resentment, the racing mind, the emptiness inside, the real alcoholism. I had all of that before I ever drank. And then when I drank, it was like, oh, it made that stuff go away for a little while. I thought it was like the best Christmas present ever. Give me some more of that. And so I drank alcoholically almost from the very beginning. And I remember my friends took me out on my 16th birthday. And this is in the 80s. Well, let me see, what year was that? That was probably 78, probably. And they took me out to a bar. And this was in Florida because I was living in Florida at the time. And they didn't card you or anything. And they ordered me a tequila sunrise. And I remember looking at that drink and how beautiful it was. And it really did look like a sunrise with a little umbrella in it. And I just drank that down and they couldn't get me to leave the bar. My friends were like, we got to go. We can't stay here. We got to go. No, no, let's have one more. Yeah. And that's pretty much how it went. So, and I would do very, like sort of exhibitionist things when I was drinking. Like I would moon people out the car window, pee in the parking lot, like stuff like that. I would behave in very inappropriate manner when I was drinking. And any morals that I had, and I kind of, prized myself on my values and my morals, they just went out the window too when I was drinking. So by the time I was in that last semester of college, I had done some pretty demeaning things, um, passed out in the bathroom in a disgusting bar and picked up guys and one night stands and, all the stuff we do. And um, hated myself afterwards and swore I was never going to do it again and did it again. And the over and over nature of this disease. And um, I really, I didn't really want to stop drinking. I wanted to feel different and I wanted my life to get better. I didn't have any friends. I just had drinking buddies. I just had that constant loneliness and emptiness, and I just wanted to feel better. And so I went to that meeting. And it was a big meeting. It was a big book meeting, and it was large, probably 50 or 60 people. I mean, here for Boise, that's a big meeting. And I walked into that room, I looked around, and there was one person in there that I actually knew that I had known from school. And everybody else was older than me. Not that I really cared that much. But I sat through that meeting and I felt like every single person in there was talking directly to me, just like when I had read the big book. Everything they said. And, later, of course, I found out they were talking to me because I was the newcomer in the room, right? So they're sharing their stories for me. And I felt like I belonged for the first time, but I didn't want to belong there. I really did want to be an alcoholic. It took a little while for me to admit that I was, but it really wasn't that hard. Once the women started talking to me after the meeting, they suggested I go through the chapter more about alcoholism and underline what I related to, look for the similarities, not the differences. And when I did all that, I had so many things underlined, and they went over it with me afterwards. And during that time period, I decided I would just quit drinking for a week while I was reading the book. And then I would go back to this meeting the following week. And I drank during that week. And it wasn't just I drank, it was the debate in my head. I said I wasn't going to do it, but it's not that big of a deal. This isn't really a drink, it's a coffee drink. That's not a real drink. And then that whole thing and blah, blah, blah. And I'm talking to my sister because we were at lunch and I'm telling her my whole committee about it. She's like, well, have it if you want it, because she didn't know I was going to AA. And so I did, I drank it. And I didn't have another drink, but I sure wanted to. I wanted to so bad. I just wanted to have that, just another one and another one and another one. And the last time I really got drunk, I couldn't get drunk enough. I weighed like 100 pounds. I was a teeny tiny little thing and I drank like 10 drinks, 10 rum and cokes. I couldn't get drunk enough. So in a fairly short amount of time, I was able to admit I was an alcoholic, came into the program. And that's really all I'm going to say about drinking is just the identification. I definitely belong here. But I want to talk about the real alcoholism because I have now gone through 40 years in this program and I have seen a lot. I have experienced a lot. There's probably other people here with a lot of sobriety time who know what I'm talking about. And you just see everything in this program. You see people come in the revolving door and you see people who you think are really going to make it and they don't. You see people who've been working steps 20 years who shoot themselves in the head. You see people who, screw around on their wives and relapse. You see people, you see it all. But you also see the people who make it. You see the people who realize over a period of time that they have to deepen their relationship with God in order to survive. And not just survive, but to thrive in this program. And and I watched people, and my sponsor was one of those people. My second sponsor, the one I mentioned before, he was a oil field roughneck. We couldn't be more different. And a lot of people thought it was wrong for me to have a man sponsor, but he really was like a father to me. And there was never anything more than that, a type of affection between us. And I needed a father figure. I'd never had one. And he was a good one, and he'd talk to me, he'd tell me the truth, but he did it with love. He always did it with love. And I also hung around the guys a lot because he would do these 12 steps at coffee, like we go to Denny's after the meeting. He'd do these 12-step calls, and he would let me sit in, on those, and I would just be quiet and listen. But I learned so much about how to 12-step and how to work with people. And it is a little bit different with women, but not that different. The alcoholism's the same. So he was a joy. He died the same year my father died. He died of lupus, but he died sober. And he was such a good man. I really miss him sometimes. And then I didn't have a sponsor for 10 years after that. That's not something I recommend because I went pretty crazy. And I really thought, well, I know how to work the program. I don't need a sponsor. I know how to do this. I can just work the steps. I'll fifth step with somebody every once in a while. I'll just, I'll pray. I know how to, I'll write inventory. I'll make amends when I owe amends. I don't need to talk to anybody. And what happened with me is the real alcoholism took over, and I became arrogant. I became, how would I describe it? I got back all of the bedevilments, most of them, not all of them, most of them. I mean, I wasn't broke like I was when I came into the program, but that's because I was married. It wasn't because I was making a lot of money. Um, I had some material possessions, but the insanity, the lack of emotional sobriety, the feeling of uselessness, the self-pity, um, the feeling that everybody else was my problem, that came back. And and I did find a relationship with God when I came into AA and did the steps. And I found a God who loved the unlovable and forgave the unforgivable. I found the God of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I found a purpose in working with others, and I sponsored a ton of people, over the years. Lots of women, and a lot of them stayed sober. But something happened along the line and I didn't grow spiritually, And the big book tells us that if we don't grow, if we don't if we don't take steps to grow in our spirituality, then we risk relapse. And there's a lot of ways to relapse. You don't have to drink to relapse. You can relapse on crazy. That's what I did. I so that was about I want to say right it was before the pandemic. So probably in like 2017 I started to really go emotionally downhill. I probably honestly needed to be in a mental institution because I felt I was so depressed and I felt like I could not handle my life. I had four kids. My husband had two, I had two. They were all using drugs and alcohol. And my oldest son was an opiate addict. And I was constantly terrified that I was going to get a knock on the door and he was going to be dead. My mom was sick. She wanted me to be her caretaker, and I was not up to the task. Uh, her husband died, and then she became very dependent on me after that happened. And I just could not handle that, and we had all this going on, and I was having problems in my marriage. This is my third marriage. And I told my husband, I'm like, I need to get out of here. I cannot, I need to go. And we'd been talking about taking a trip around the world for a long time. And I said, let's just go. Let's just do it. And my husband was pretty crazy at the time too. He's in the program also. We were both nuts. And he's like, okay. So he quit his job. We had some money in the bank. We got a big IRS check back that we weren't expecting, for something having to do with his business. I don't know, but we had this big check. And I'm like, let's just go. This is our chance. So we did. We left the country for a year. We went traveled around. We went to like 25 countries, and we went to meetings every country we went to. But all of the places we went, we would go to these spiritual sites. Like we went to Bhutan and we went to Tiger's Nest, which is like a monastery. And it's like a pilgrimage. You go up, climb up these steps to this monastery. We went to Jordan and we saw the site where Jesus was baptized. We went to Israel and we went to Jerusalem. We spent a week in Jerusalem and we went to the old city and toured the old city. And I didn't even know where I was most of the time, but I knew some of the places were holy places because you can tell, you can feel it when you're there. Um, and we went to Spain and we went to cathedrals, and I mean, every place we went, we were looking for signs of the divine, and we would find them. But we didn't know that's what we were looking for. I didn't know that's what I was looking for. I thought I already found God, and that's all there was. And at the end of that time, well, about halfway through, my husband's mother got sick. She had brain cancer, and we had to come back to the States while she had brain surgery. And she was living in Miami, and we went down there, and he had been going back and forth to Miami to help his sister with his mom before we went on this trip. And so we came back. She had the surgery, and we stayed for about a month. And then we went back to Europe, and we finished up the last 5 months in Europe. And my younger son came to Ireland and spent a couple weeks with us. And my mom came and spent a month with us in Croatia. So, we kept in contact with our family. But my older son, his name was Kieran, he was in Cambodia. He was a wanderer. He was a commercial fisherman and a wanderer. And so he would work half the year in Dutch Harbor, Alaska as a commercial fisherman. And then the other half of the year he would travel. And we tried to connect with him during that time, but we just couldn't keep up with him. We couldn't catch up with him. And he was in Southeast Asia, and it was just way too hot. I was like, I'm not going to Southeast Asia. It's just too hot. So we did go to Vietnam, but the northern part of Vietnam. And then we finished up our time in Europe, and we came back. And my husband had met a guy when we were in Florida, who became his sponsor. And my husband hadn't had a sponsor either for any of that time. And we both had long-term sobriety, but we didn't have emotional sobriety. So my husband found this new sponsor, and his new sponsor was a guy my husband's Jewish, and this guy was Jewish, but he had become a Christian. And he started talking to my husband. I don't know, my husband just sort of got intrigued by the things that he had to say. And he talked a lot about emotional sobriety. And I started going to these Zoom, well, and then the pandemic hit, of course, in 2019. So once we came home, we had gone to these in-person meetings while we were in Florida, but then the pandemic hit and everything went to Zoom. And all of a sudden, he was able to make connections with his sponsor and some of these other guys that his sponsor sponsored, and men's meetings. And my husband had never had that here in Boise, that kind of a fellowship. And so it really helped him. And I could see these changes in him, these dramatic changes. Is somebody keeping the time so you can tell me when I need to be quiet? Somebody let me know when give me like a 1 minute warning, please. Okay, thank you. Um, anyway, he started changing, and I saw these changes in him, these drastic changes, like totally out of character. Not like he started doing all the housework, for example. That's like a small thing, but like he never did that before. And, just being nicer, being kinder, being more thoughtful and considerate. And he wasn't trying to do it, it just was like happening. And I got interested in what he was doing. I'm like, what is going on with this? So I started going to these meetings too. And I was very resistant, because I had a lot of prejudice and I was probably as belligerent, full of belligerent denial as any newcomer walking in the rooms at that point, because I really had digressed backwards in my growth. So it took a lot of time for things to sink in, but over time, a period of time of listening and talking to people and listening to people, I realized how screwed up I was. And I had a second surrender, you know. I had a second surrender. It took probably 4 years of a process of this happening. But in 2022, November of 2022, I asked God if he wanted me to follow Christ. And I didn't want to do it, but, but I just decided I'd put God in charge and ask him what he wanted me to do. And he showed me the answer was yes. And a few months later, I gave my life to the Lord. And I just said, here I am. Do what you want with me. I've screwed it up all across the board. I can't handle it. Help me. And he did. He came into my life, moved around the furniture, changed me, changed my husband, changed everything about our marriage. And that was 2022. And in January of 2023, my son Kieran died of a fentanyl overdose on a boat alone in Dutch Harbor, Alaska. He didn't show up for a shift and somebody found him. And I guess I thought, you know, my prayers were like, Lord, I gave you my life and this is what happens. That's how I felt at the time. And I asked the question why a lot, why? That's the wrong question, because there is no why. Some things are a mystery. I don't know why God allows bad things to happen. But what I do know is God knew that I was going to need him. And that's why things happened the way they did. That's why when I gave my life to the Lord, he knew I was going to need him. And that's what I believe now is, that his love and his mercy, he showed me his love and his mercy because I would have never gotten through that without it. I wanted to die so I could go be with my son. I never thought about drinking, which is an absolute miracle. But I thought about dying a lot. I didn't want to be alive. Even though I had another child, my other son, I have my husband, but the grief and the loss and the pain was just so great that I really didn't want to live, and it's been 3.5 years now. And I still like today, I cried for about a half hour, just thinking about my son. I mean, the grief takes a long time, and I don't think it ever goes away entirely. But I am able to function a lot better now. And I found my way back to the church of my childhood, which is the Catholic Church. And I did it in kind of a circuitous route. I first I went to the evangelical Christians, and I still hang out with a bunch of them. But then I went to a Protestant church, And then I tried like 10 different churches. And then I went to a retreat at a monastery. And while I was there, I went to confession for like the first time in 30 years. And something happened. And I don't know what happened, but when I came home, I wanted to go to mass. And I trust me, this is not like anything I've ever experienced because I never wanted to go to church. I was always looking at my watch. How long is it going to take? But I wanted to go, and I realized after I started going to daily mass in the morning, there's like 10 people there, but it was quiet and it was short and it was simple and nobody bothered me. Nobody even really talked to me for a long time. I just went to there to be with the Lord. And that those quiet, simple mornings, I'm still doing that. And it started to give me a little bit of energy. And it started to give me a deeper sense of purpose. And I started to feel better. And I got the feeling that I was being carried and that I could just rest in God and everything was going to be okay if I just rested in God. And that I didn't have to do anything. And I've always been a doer, you know, sponsor the people, chase the newcomers out of the room and try to get them to, I don't know. I was always like, I always had to do things, volunteer here, take care of this, take care of this person, take care of that person. I couldn't do any of it anymore. And the Lord just told me in my heart, I mean, He didn't speak out loud, but in my heart and in my mind, He said, you don't have to do anything for me to love you. I will carry you and you can just rest in me. And so that's what I did. And I talked to Mother Mary too, because, she lost her son and she knew what it was like. So I went to like for the first time in, oh my gosh, so many years, I went to the Stations of the Cross that Lent, because Lent was after my son's death. And I talked to Mother Mary and she comforted me. And I can't explain that. I can't explain any of those things. Why they happened, what happened. All I know is I've had a psychic change and my marriage is like better than it's ever been. And my other son, our relationship has changed dramatically. And he's an alcoholic. My younger son's an alcoholic, but I can love him and I don't have to keep a wall up with him and a distance. And I don't have to try to shove the program down his throat, and he doesn't really believe in God. And he's like, when he found out I went back to my church, he's like, oh no. But I just try to be a living example, and it's not what I say anyway, it's who I am that is going to make a difference in his life. And so I try to listen and encourage him and support him for anything healthy he does. I try to support him and listen and encourage him. And my stepdaughter, Olivia, I'm going to probably have to leave like right at 7 because she's getting her 1 year chip. She's also an opiate addict. She overdosed several times, and just by chance, someone was with her who revived her. Um, the guy she was using with was a paramedic, and he gave her CPR. He broke her sternum, but he saved her life. And she's got her 1 year today. And so I got to be there to see her get her chip. I'm going to be late to the meeting, but I told them I had to speak at a different meeting, but I would be there in time for her to get her chip at the end. Um, and it's an absolute miracle, what this has done, how it's changed her, and I don't know, I I know that God can take bad things and make good come out of them. I don't think He like makes bad things happen because I believe that God is all good, but He can take something terrible like my son's death and He can make something good come out of it because that's how He works. You know, he can make anything good. And her sobriety is a good that never would have been if my son hadn't died. That's what I believe. And I don't believe, I mean, I'd rather have my son back, you know? I mean, if I'm honest, that's how I feel. But it's a gift that she's sober and that she's going to live, you know? And my husband doesn't have to go through what I've been through, you know? It's all God. It's all God. There's absolutely no human power that would have stopped her. We tried, because we've tried everything. And, you know, so, uh, this program saved my life the first time and it saved me the second time. So God bless this program and God bless all of you. And thank you so much for having me and giving me an opportunity to share with you tonight. So I'll stop there. Thanks.